We will be discussing a few significant developments that have just occurred as regards Ripple XRP and SEC. The SEC situation appears to be at an all-time low and is rapidly deteriorating. I wanted to quickly address the reasons for the recent huge dump on the XRP price chart. We have been closely observing this formation, as you may have seen if you have been monitoring this channel for the past few days. Very closely. In essence, I was arguing that to drive XRP beyond this top-line resistance and truly into price discovery, we needed to witness big development out of Ripple swell. Sadly, today marked the second day of Ripple swell. Although it was an excellent conference and we learned a great deal, there was no significant news on XRP or a game-changing alliance, and as a result, we felt as though we had been rejected off this line. You are welcome to Crypto World Educate. If you are coming across this channel for the first time, kindly hit that subscribe button, like and leave a comment. We know viewers are the lifeline of every channel and we are very grateful. As I've been saying, there are still a lot of factors that might spur the cryptocurrency market as a whole. For example, institutions are currently announcing that there is nearly a 100% probability that a Bitcoin spot ETF will be available by year's end. This is probably going to trigger a significant influx of institutional liquidity back into the market, which may serve as the next impetus to ultimately push over this top-line support. But as of right now, this entity has truly rejected us. We stumbled around a little, and the main reason for that was that there was no compelling storage to introduce us to price discovery. Institutional investors have little reason to be excited. Nothing was happening to bring in fresh liquidity to the market. And as a result, we experienced a breakdown as opposed to a breakthrough. All I wanted to do was bring that up. It has nothing to do with any negative incident. Not that this is detrimental to XRP in the long run. We continue to exert pressure on this upper support. All we had was the news. We lacked the necessary spark. We lacked the enthusiasm to drive further liquidity into XRP and to top all of us to unprecedented heights. Now though, I want to get on to more intriguing things and I want to briefly discuss the Ripple SEC case. As for the US banks and institutions, if you've listened to Brad Garlinghouse and the rest of the Ripple team discuss where they stand right now, they're saying they're all very confident in their abilities since we beat the SEC. Even while they all have a great deal of confidence in our legal position, they ultimately require clarification on the issue as a whole before they will be willing to work with Ripple. We still need to keep an eye on this matter since the SEC is still pursuing it, which means that until it is resolved, Ripple will find it extremely difficult to form new partnerships in the US. That being said, it doesn't imply that large financial institutions aren't observing Ripple and concluding that XRP isn't a security. We can't wait to utilize them in the future. It simply means that until this matter is resolved, we aren't able to make any formal collaborations at this time. In a recent brief that was released today, attorney Fred Riscolet made a pretty intriguing observation. Now this submission wasn't all that significant, but attorneys were investigating a lot of stuff behind the scenes. This is all tea. Lee Frieding's attorney Fred said, but this letter, in my opinion, lacks the cervix tone that most of the earlier ones had, which is simply a very clear or pointed type of anger. The parties even reached a certain consensus. I still think that this issue will be resolved sooner than the SEC anticipates. Attorney Fred appears to believe that there is a discussion taking place behind the scenes that is effectively pulling these parties closer, even though we are still in the ceremony stage of this and both sides are still posturing. Since the SEC truly has nothing more to lose, this is basically what I've been saying for a long time. They received their penalties from Ripple. They will have to reimburse them. And as I will demonstrate, even if the SEC goes the extra mile, they might not receive any compensation. As attorney Fred is hinting at above, the SEC's greatest hope of collecting any money from Ripple for its institutional sales of XRP may be to settle. Allow me to share with you some of the recent important news that has placed the SEC in a very precarious position. 2 opinions from the Supreme Court. The first one is particularly intriguing. It states that sales of XRP that were considered securities had to have taken place in the US for Ripple to be held virtually accountable. Now this presents a significant issue for the SEC because virtually all of Ripple's institutional XRP sales occurred outside of the country. In other words, the SEC is effectively losing out on a significant chunk of its penalties right now. For institutional transactions totaling $600 million, the SEC filed charges against Ripple. However, consider the possibility that $500 million of those sales did not occur in the US. All of a sudden, the SEC's penalties were nearly eliminated. In actuality, it was even worse than that. The majority of institutional sales did not occur within the United States, Thus, the SEC's fine would be severely impacted by this. The SEC is currently in negotiations to receive $600 million. However, since none of the sales occurred in the US, that $600 million might be drastically reduced if this lawsuit continues, and that would remove it beyond the SEC's purview according to the case law that is currently in effect. The other extremely intriguing development that occurred recently is that the SEC can now essentially file a claim for damages, which is what they are attempting to obtain from Ripple. The damage is more than $600 million. Institutional investors have to have experienced a loss on XRP for those to be considered damages. Have you looked at the price chart for XRP? Right now, XRP is trading nearly at its highest point ever recorded in its existence. Yes, there were a few months when it was higher. But in light of XRP's price history, those are minor losses. The majority of institutional investors made their purchases a long time ago. Therefore, they have all made money. What is meant by that? Taking that into account, together with the fact that Ripple was forced to sell the XRP outside of the US, you can only conclude that even if the XRP was sold within the US, damages would only be incurred if institutional investors also suffered a loss. As you can see, the SDC essentially has no case about institutional sales regarding any penalties Ripple may be required to pay. The reason for this is that Ripple essentially got around all the US security rules that they could have broken. Therefore, there is no real recourse for Ripple selling that XRP, even though the company was selling XRP to institutions, and none of those sales were classified as securities. The reason for that is that it was completed outside of the US and hardly nobody was harmed in the transaction. In essence, nothing was harmed. Although it was against the law to sell XRP to these entities, no Americans were harmed in the process. This is the hilarious thing about the current state of this case. The SEC is effectively telling you right now that you owe them $600 million. If they are successful in getting Ripple to the table, Ripple might say, you know what? You'll receive $100 million if you finish this now. Now you would think the SEC would have had a solid case. They would reply, no way, we're going the distance. We want all $600 million if they have any supporting evidence. However, the current situation is predicated on the case law that is being decided. It may not be the case for the SEC. In the US, institutional sales might not exist at all. That might remove the whole $600 million from the equation. All institutional investors may be currently profitable, which would refute the SEC's $600 million assertion. Ripple wants this lawsuit to be over. They need this issue to be resolved to attract institutional investors and operate their business in the United States. Thank you for joining us on this enlightening journey. If you found value, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more exciting content. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay inspired and keep exploring.